The Nexus Prime Library existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, which was either a marvel of engineering or the universe's way of showing off, depending on who you asked. Most beings considered it the crown jewel of galactic civilization. A repository containing the collective knowledge of 4,000 species across 800 million years. The building itself defied conventional physics with the casual arrogance of something that had outgrown the need to care about little things like structural integrity or the laws of thermodynamics. Ethan Blackwater, however, was currently questioning every life choice that had led him to this particular corner of dimensional impossibility. He stood in Section Gamma 7, also known by its more charming designation, the Primitive Species Archive. The sign might as well have read, "Here lie the intellectual dregs of galactic society," in glowing Xantharian script, complete with a helpful arrow pointing toward the human collection. The irony wasn't lost on him that humanity's greatest literary achievements were housed between the Gracchian Empire's collection of ceremonial rock-stacking manuals and a species that had apparently achieved spaceflight, while still communicating exclusively through interpretive dance. At least the dancers had managed to digitize their flailing movements. Humans, in their infinite wisdom, had insisted on maintaining their physical books even after joining the galactic community. Primitives clinging to dead trees, the Altarian head librarian had sniffed during Ethan's orientation, her crystalline features arranged in what passed for disdain among her species. Your people refuse to abandon these artifacts of organic matter. Most inefficient. Inefficient, perhaps, but Ethan found comfort in the weight of actual books, the smell of aging paper, and the satisfying thump when he dropped particularly pretentious poetry collection. It was a small rebellion against a universe that had automated everything else, including, apparently, the ability to experience joy. The Altarians had evolved past emotions approximately 3 million years ago, and considered it one of their finest achievements. They were also, coincidentally, the most boring conversationalists in known space, which made today's discovery particularly interesting. Ethan pulled the slim volume from its designated spot, a first edition of Collected Works of Human Philosophy, Volume 12, and nearly dropped it when a piece of actual paper fluttered to the floor. Not a holographic projection, not a crystalline data fragment, not even one of those insufferable quantum state document chips that changed text based on the reader's emotional state. This was honest-to-earth paper, cream-colored and slightly rough to the touch. He picked it up, noting with professional curiosity that the handwriting was distinctly human, cursive even, which was about as primitive as communication got in a galaxy where most species transmitted thoughts directly through bio-neural networks. "You have excellent taste in pessimistic philosophers," the note read, though Nietzsche might argue that reading him in a library 17 dimensions removed from Earth somewhat misses the point about embracing the abyss. Ethan glanced around the archive. The nearest life form was a crystalline collective drone organizing mineral deposits 3 aisles away, their geometric body humming with the efficiency of someone who had never experienced the simple pleasure of procrastination. The probability of them writing a note about human philosophy was roughly equivalent to a black hole developing a sense of humor. He flipped the paper over. More handwriting. Different this time, older, more formal. P.S. You might want to check the Dostoevsky collection. Someone's been filing Crime and Punishment under comedic literature. Even by galactic standards, that's impressively wrong. Now that was interesting. The library's cataloging system was run by an AI with an IQ that required scientific notation to express properly. It didn't make mistakes. It especially didn't make mistakes about human literature, since it had consumed and analyzed every piece of human writing in approximately 14 seconds after first contact. Ethan made his way to the Russian literature section, dodging a floating platform carrying what appeared to be a sentient gas cloud reviewing poetry. He found Dostoevsky exactly where it shouldn't be, wedged between a collection of Andromedan stand-up comedy routines and something called Humorous Observations on Planetary Destruction, a Xenocide's Guide to Levity. Inside the book, another note. Getting warm, though I should mention that standing there with your mouth open like that makes you look remarkably like a Betelgeusian pleasure fish. Just saying. Ethan's mouth snapped shut. He spun around, scanning the archive with newfound paranoia. The only visible beings were the usual collection of researchers, a group of Epsilon Eridani scholars, whose heads rotated independently of their bodies, making surveillance technically possible but highly unlikely given their notorious inability to focus on anything for more than 30 seconds. Lone vegan academic whose species had evolved past the need for written language and was probably just here for the interdimensional Wi-Fi. And something that looked like a walking tree stump, but was actually a highly advanced artificial intelligence from the Centauri system, currently absorbed in what appeared to be a catalog of extinct cheeses. Nobody was paying attention to one human archivist having an existential crisis in the philosophy section. He opened the book again, and nearly had a heart attack when he found a third note that definitely hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. Relax. You're not going crazy. Well, probably not. The jury's still out on that one, considering you chose to become a librarian in a galaxy where most species have evolved past the need for books. But we'll work with what we've got. This was impossible. The library's security systems monitored every molecular change within its wall. Nothing could be added or removed without triggering alerts that would wake hibernating civilizations on the far side of the galaxy. The place was more secure than most planetary defense systems, and considerably more paranoid. Yet here he was, holding physical evidence that someone or something was playing an elaborate game of cosmic hide-and-seek, using Earth's literary heritage as a playground. Ethan carefully placed the book back on its shelf and took a step back, running mental calculation. Option 1. He was experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by prolonged exposure to alien architecture that hurt human brains to look at directly. Option 2. Someone with access to technology so advanced it made galactic security look like a child's toy was using it to leave him reading recommendations. Both options suggested he needed either professional help or a very strong drink, possibly both. He was reaching for his communicator to request a transfer to somewhere less existentially challenging, perhaps asteroid mining, where the worst thing that could happen was explosive decompression, when another piece of paper materialized in his hand. Not slipped from a shelf, materialized, as in one moment his hand was empty, and the next it contained what appeared to be a grocery list written on the back of a coffee shop receipt. "Don't panic," it read, "and definitely don't call for back. Trust me, trying to explain this to a crystalline collective security drone would be like teaching calculus to a particularly stubborn houseplant. Some conversations are better avoided." At the bottom, in smaller handwriting, "Also, you might want to sit down for the next part." Ethan remained standing, partly out of stubbornness and partly because the nearest chair was occupied by a being whose species classified furniture as a form of primitive torture. He was beginning to suspect that whoever was doing this knew him better than the Galactic personnel files suggested, which was either touching or terrifying. The next note appeared tucked behind his ear. "Stubborn. I like that in a human." Most species would have either reported this to authorities or assumed they were experiencing a neurological malfunction by now. But not you. You're going to keep reading, aren't you? She was right, of course. He was absolutely going to keep reading, despite every rational instinct screaming that this was how horror stories began. But then again, rational instincts were what had landed him in the primitive species archive in the first place. So clearly they weren't his strong suit. The handwriting was becoming familiar now, and he found himself oddly disappointed when several minutes passed without a new note appearing, which probably said something unflattering about his social life. But he chose not to examine that too close. By the end of his first week of note hunting, Ethan had developed what could charitably be called a system, and what his alien colleagues more accurately described as human-level organizational chaos. He'd requisitioned a primitive paper notebook, much to the horror of the supply drone, whose optical sensors had actually flickered in confusion at the request, and begun cataloging every mysterious message with the dedication of someone who had clearly lost perspective on appropriate workplace behavior. Note Done 47 had appeared in a copy of Advanced Quantum Mechanics for the Philosophically Inclined, which was already suspicious since Ethan had specifically avoided that book for 3 years running. The message read, "You're tracking these notes like a detective, aren't you? Very human of you." Most species would have reported this as a glitch and moved on with their lives. "Your stubbornness is both admirable and slightly concerning." What was concerning was how right she was. Because yes, Ethan had started thinking of the note writer as she based purely on the handwriting analysis he'd performed during his lunch breaks. which raised the question of why he was spending his lunch breaks analyzing alien mystery handwriting instead of, say, eating lunch like a normal person. The Altarian supervisor, crystalline formation 7 alpha Dezegen professional disappointment, had started giving him what passed for concerned looks among her species. This mainly involved her geometric head tilting at precisely 15-degree angles, while her optical processors hummed with disapproval. Archivist Blackwater, she'd said that morning, her voice carrying the musical quality of wind chimes in a cosmic storm. Your productivity metrics have decreased by 12%. Additionally, you have been observed conversing with inanimate objects. This behavior pattern suggests either neurological degradation or what humans refer to as talking to yourself, both of which require administrative intervention. Ethan had looked up from note down 23, which had materialized inside his morning coffee cup, and somehow managed to stay dry despite being submerged in liquid caffeine. I'm not talking to myself. I'm talking to someone who's apparently mastered interdimensional note delivery, while the rest of us are still figuring out how to make the coffee machines work properly. Crystalline Formation 7 Alpha had processed this statement for exactly 4.7 seconds before her head tilted to a precise 30-degree angle. That explanation is either profoundly sophisticated or profoundly insane. Given your species' track record, I am statistically inclined toward the latter. She wasn't wrong. Humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy for finding complicated solutions to simple problems, and simple solutions to complicated problems, usually simultaneous. They'd achieved faster-than-light travel by accidentally discovering that space-time could be folded like laundry if you hit it with enough concentrated stubbornness and caffeine. Meanwhile, they still couldn't agree on whether pineapple belonged on pizza. But the notes were becoming increasingly personal, and that was where things got genuinely weird. Note down 31 had referenced his childhood dog, a golden retriever named Einstein, who'd had an unfortunate habit of eating theoretical physics textbook. Note down 38 had mentioned his recurring nightmare about being trapped in a library, where all the books were written in languages that changed every time he looked at them. The problem was, neither of these facts existed in any galactic database. The Confederation kept detailed psychological profiles on all member species, but they focused on useful information like combat effectiveness and economic productivity. They didn't catalog childhood pets or anxiety dreams, partly because most advanced species had evolved past the need for either. Note down 52 had appeared yesterday inside a book he'd been specifically instructed not to read, Human Military Strategy: A Study in Creative Violence, which was filed in the restricted cultural artifacts section for reasons nobody wanted to explain to him. You're wondering how I know things about you that aren't in any official records, it had said. Here's a hint. The universe is much stranger than your species suspects, and much more familiar than the rest of the galaxy wants to admit. Also, you should really read that military strategy book. Trust me on this one. Today's note had been the most unsettling yet. He'd found it tucked inside Love Poems of Old Earth, a collection he'd never opened because reading romantic poetry in a library where most species reproduced through complex chemical negotiations felt somehow inappropriate. You're starting to look forward to finding these, aren't you? It read. That's either sweet or slightly stalkerish, depending on perspective. I'm choosing to go with sweet, since I'm the one leaving them. Anyway, tomorrow's Friday. Check the cookbook section specifically, the one about comfort food. You're going to need it. Ethan had spent considerable time wondering what exactly he was going to need comfort food for, until note down 54 appeared during his morning routine, somehow wedged between the pages of his personal copy of Meditation Techniques for Dimensional Travelers, a book he kept in his private quarters, and had never brought to the library. That's when he'd realized that wherever these notes were coming from, they weren't limited by the conventional boundaries of space-time or his personal privacy, which should have been terrifying but was instead oddly comforting, like having a cosmic pen pal who happened to possess reality-bending powers and a concerning interest in his reading habits. His alien colleagues had started giving him a wider berth, which was actually an improvement in workplace relations. The vegan academic had stopped trying to engage him in philosophical discussions about the futility of physical literature, and the Epsilon Eridani scholars had ceased their attempts to convince him to digitize the entire human collection for efficiency purposes. Even the walking tree stump AI had paused in its endless cataloging to observe him with what might have been curiosity, though it was difficult to tell since its facial expressions consisted entirely of bark patterns that shifted with the lighting. Note 55 had materialized while he was having this exact thought. Your colleagues think you're developing what they call primitive emotional attachment to inanimate objects. They're not entirely wrong, except for the part where they assume the objects are inanimate. Reality is more flexible than most beings like to admit, and consciousness has a tendency to show up in the strangest places. Ethan had looked around the archive, suddenly seeing the books differently. Thousands of volumes containing human thoughts, dreams, fears, and discoveries, all dismissed as primitive by a galaxy that had forgotten that wisdom and technology weren't necessarily the same thing. Maybe that was the point. Maybe someone was trying to remind him that being human wasn't something to apologize for, even in a universe where emotions were considered evolutionary mistakes, and handwritten notes were archaeological curiosity. Or maybe he really was losing his mind, and the notes were just his brain's way of making exile in the primitive species archive feel less like professional purgatory, and more like an adventure. Either way, he was definitely checking the cookbook section tomorrow. If nothing else, he was curious about what kind of comfort food could prepare someone for whatever came next in a library, where the impossible had apparently become routine. After all, in a universe where starships ran on crystallized mathematics, and entire civilizations existed as pure thought, the idea that someone might communicate through handwritten notes stuck in books wasn't really that strange, was it? The cookbook section, as it turned out, was located in what the library's mapping system cheerfully described as Dimensional Sublevel Paradox 7, which was the architectural equivalent of saying good luck finding it, in 17 different languages simultaneously. Ethan had expected this, since the Nexus Prime Library had been designed by a committee of beings who thought navigation should be an intellectual challenge rather than a basic necessity. What he hadn't expected was for the route to keep changing. He'd started with the standard approach, following the holographic directory markers that bobbed through the air like helpful fireflies with superiority complexes. These had led him through the economics archive, past the xenobiology section, and straight into a wall that definitely hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. The wall was now displaying a helpful message in glowing text: dimensional reconfiguration in progress. Please stand by. Estimated completion time: 7 local hours or 1 cosmic heartbeat, whichever comes last. Brilliant, Ethan muttered, consulting his paper map. Yes, he'd drawn an actual paper map, because apparently his descent into primitive behavior was accelerating. Just absolutely brilliant. That's when he'd found note done 56, somehow attached to his map, despite the fact that he'd been holding it the entire time. Maps are cute, but they won't help where you're going. The library rearranges itself based on need, not logic. Think less like a human trying to get somewhere, and more like someone who's already where they need to be. Also, take the left corridor that doesn't exist yet. Ethan looked to his left. Solid wall, decorated with a mural depicting the first Galactic peace treaty being signed by what appeared to be a squid, a geometric shape, and something that might have been a sentient mathematical equation. No corridor in sight. He waited. After exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds, the wall began to ripple like water, and a passage opened with the casual inevitability of something that had always been there, and was only now bothering to become visible. Beyond it lay a corridor that stretched in directions that weren't covered in standard human geometry textbooks. Right, Ethan said to nobody in particular, because normal corridors are for species without imagination. The passage led him through sections of the library he'd never seen before, despite having worked there for 2 years. He passed archives that appeared to be storing concepts rather than books, shelves lined with crystalline containers holding what looked like bottled thought. The air hummed with the kind of energy that made his teeth itch and his brain feel slightly too large for his skull. A sign floated past, written in script that rearranged itself as he read: Cultural Preservation Wing. Authorized personnel only. Warning: this section contains ideas considered dangerous by 17 different civilizations. Enter at own risk of existential enlightenment. Note down 57 materialized in his pocket as he walked. You're in the restricted archives now. Don't worry about the warning signs. They're mostly for species that haven't figured out how to think paradoxically yet.
Humans excel at believing contradictory things simultaneously. It's one of your most useful traits, though most of the galaxy considers it a design flaw. The corridor ended at a door that wasn't quite a door, more like a suggestion of an opening that reality had decided to take serious. Beyond it lay something that made Ethan's perception hiccup, a room that was somehow both vast and intimate, filled with shelves that extended in impossible directions while somehow remaining within comfortable reaching distance. And the books. These weren't just human books. These were human books that shouldn't exist. First editions of works from authors he'd never heard of, collections from civilizations that had been destroyed before writing systems were invented, and bound volumes that seemed to contain the very essence of human experience, distilled into pages that glowed with soft, warm light. Note Don 58 was waiting on a reading table that had clearly been positioned for someone of exactly his height. Welcome to the real collection. Everything you've been cataloging upstairs is just the overflow. This is where we keep the important stuff, the books that remember what it means to be human even when humans forget. The coordinates you'll need for the next section are hidden in the book that calls to you most strongly. Trust your instincts. They're more sophisticated than you think. The book that called to him most strongly turned out to be a leather-bound journal with no title, sitting alone on a shelf that seemed to exist solely to hold it, which should have been his first clue that this entire situation had moved well beyond the realm of coincidence and into the territory of cosmic orchestration, with a sense of dramatic timing. Inside the journal, instead of text, he found a single set of coordinates written in what he now recognized as her handwriting. Below them, an address that made his brain hurt, Pocket Dimension 7's SCI-FI temporal overlap zone, where yesterday meets tomorrow and they both agree to disagree. The universe, Ethan reflected, really needed to work on its addressing system. Following the coordinates required walking through what appeared to be a mirror, which turned out to be less of a mirror and more of a doorway that had gotten confused about its fundamental property. The sensation was like stepping through liquid silver while someone rearranged his molecular structure according to a blueprint drawn by someone with questionable spatial reasoning skills. On the other side, he found himself in a space that could only be described as a library's idea of a cozy living room. Bookshelves lined walls that curved in directions that shouldn't exist, filled with volumes that seemed to rearrange themselves based on mood rather than any cataloging system known to galactic science. A fireplace crackled merrily despite the apparent absence of wood, oxygen or any understanding of basic physics. And sitting in an armchair that looked suspiciously like something from Earth's 20th century was a woman who appeared to be roughly his age, if his age had been adjusted for temporal displacement and interdimensional travel. She looked up from a book, an actual physical book, and smiled with the expression of someone who'd been expecting him for quite some time. "You're earlier than I calculated," she said, closing the volume and setting it aside. "Though I suppose that's what I get for using linear time as a reference point. Terribly limiting concept. Linear time. Most of the galaxy figured that out eons ago." Ethan stood in the doorway, experiencing the peculiar sensation of his worldview rearranging itself around new information. "You're human. Observant. Though technically I'm a human who's been unstuck in time for the past few subjective decades, while setting up a preservation network across 17 different temporal zones. It's complicated work, but someone has to do it." She gestured to a chair that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Please, sit. We have approximately 37 minutes before this pocket dimension shifts to its next temporal coordinate, and I'd rather not explain this twice." Ethan sat, partly because the chair looked comfortable and partly because standing was becoming more difficult as his understanding of basic reality continued to dissolve. "The notes," he began, "were and a courtship ritual, though I realize that's probably the strangest pickup line in galactic history." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with the kind of intelligence that suggested she'd seen things that would make quantum physicists weep with envy. "I've been watching you, Ethan. Not in a creepy way, well, not intentionally creepy, more in a scouting potential partners for a mission to save human culture from being forgotten by a galaxy that values efficiency over wisdom way." "That's quite a mission statement. It gets better. See, well, the galaxy's been busy evolving past emotions, intuition and the messy inefficiencies of organic thought. They've also been slowly painting themselves into a corner. Every major crisis in the past millennium has required exactly the kind of illogical, emotionally driven problem solving that advanced species have trained themselves out of. She picked up another book. This one appeared to be a collection of human love letters from various time periods. They need us, Ethan. Not our technology or our resources, but our beautiful, inefficient, wonderfully human way of approaching impossible problems with nothing but stubbornness and hope. And the notes were your way of recruiting me. The notes were my way of falling in love with your responses to them. There's a difference, though I admit the distinction might be lost on someone who spent the last week analyzing handwriting samples during lunch breaks. Her smile turned mischievous. Yes, I know about that too. Time displacement comes with excellent surveillance capabilities. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the impossible fireplace and everything to do with the realization that someone had been paying attention to him across time and space, with the dedication of someone who found his particular brand of stubborn curiosity worth preserving. So what happens now? Now we save the galaxy from its own success, one handwritten note at a time. After all, in a universe where most problems are solved by throwing advanced technology at them, sometimes the most revolutionary act is picking up a pen. Outside the pocket dimension, the Nexus Prime Library continued its eternal mission of preserving knowledge, blissfully unaware that its most primitive collection had just become the foundation for the galaxy's most sophisticated rebellion.